Greetings folks, Iolair here. In this video I'll review the cruiser skills that are part of the proposed Commander Skill System overhaul that Wargaming announced on the development blog back on September 1st, just a few days ago. I did a review of this article that you're viewing on your screen right now back on September 1st, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description below. It provides some background, general structure and approach and sort of motivation for the changes. So if you haven't seen that video, it's probably good to see that first. And then like I said, I'm going to jump into the cruiser skills here. So unlike the battleship skill review that I released yesterday, I'm going to change the structure to try to cover everything, but make it much more crisp. So yesterday's video was frankly just too long, although some people seem to appreciate the level of detail, but I do want to try to make these more consumable. So I'm aiming for something that's going to fit into about 12 minutes. So I'm timing myself on this one. All right, so rather than going to the spreadsheet and just reading just verbatim or not verbatim, but just going through the skills one by one that are assigned to the cruisers, like I did yesterday for the battleships, I'm going to go to a spreadsheet that I compiled, which organizes it by what skills are preserved, what skills are new or changed, and then what skills are being dropped for cruisers. So one thing to, just as a reminder, each class has its own skill tree. So while some skills will be preserved for some classes, they will not be for others. And we'll see examples of that here as we go through this. So starting with skills that are going to be preserved, the first one is Gunner, which is the equivalent of Expert Marksman. The differences are that, first of all, Gunner will now be a level 1 skill instead of level 2 that we have for Expert Marksman. And secondly, the buff that it provides increases turret speed by 20%, which generally speaking is going to be a buff across the board for all ships. So any ship that has turret traverse of 51 seconds roughly or better for 180 degrees, this will be a buff. So I don't know of any cruisers that have turret speed that's slower than 45 seconds, which would be the Pensacola. But I expect that for all cruisers, this is just going to be a straight up buff. All right, second item is Loader. This is Expert Loader. The function is the same, the level is the same, and there's just a name change. Same thing for the same thing for the next skill. Alarming is incoming fire alert, same function, same level. The next skill is Argus Eyed, and I mentioned this in the video yesterday. Argus, I think, is a reference to a mythological Greek character who had 100 eyes and could see in multiple directions. I kind of wish Wargaming would just keep the same names for skills that are not changing, just so that there's less to relearn, but I won't belabor that too much. The bottom line is that what is now the priority target equivalent is now a level 2 skill instead of level 1. So that's one thing to consider. The next skill is Adrenaline Rush. This is identical both by name. The main difference is that it's now a level 3 skill instead of level 2. I still think it's going to be a must-have. And by the way, I will jump into some possible cruiser builds, although there's a lot more variability with cruiser builds, I think, in some ways than we see with battleship builds. So I'm going to have just some limited speculation about how builds might be approached. And again, I'll get to that here shortly. The next skill that's being preserved is called Provident. It's identical to Superintendent, both in terms of function and the tier or the level. Next is Enduring. This is Survivability Expert that boosts your HP pool, 350 HP per tier. Again, it remains a level 3 skill and the function is the same. The next skill is Intelligence Radio Technician. This is simply radio location, same level, same function. Threshing is what's, IFHE, again, same level, same function. Now, one interesting note here is that for battleships, Threshing is a level 2 skill, and that will probably make it be more compelling for secondary builds. But for cruisers, they're keeping it this or at least the current plan is to keep this as very high investment skill. So there's still a lot of deep consideration whether it's worth taking on ships. And then lastly, is Concealment Expert, which thankfully is keeping the same name, same function, same level. All right, so those are the skills that are being preserved, mostly renames. There's some levels that have been shifted, and like I said, Gunner is largely going to be a buff. All right, now let me get to new and changed ones. So most of these are new. Some are approximate replacements for other skills. So first is Torpedo Man. This is new. It will increase the chance of flooding from torpedoes by 30%. Now, there are a couple of other torpedo-centric skills that I'll get to here in a moment. I think that this is going to be a fairly limited or narrow level of usage. So clearly the Kitakami, which is the upcoming premium Tier 10 40 torpedo launching spam boat, would clearly, this would be part of that build. I can see this and some of the other torpedo-centric skills for ships that have long-range torpedoes, and maybe players like to play them that way, or they're in game modes where torpedoes are used frequently. So I'm thinking things like some of the upper tier Royal Navy light cruisers, some of the Japanese cruisers like the Yoshino, etc. So I think this is fairly specialized, but as my colleague Jimmy Jazz said, the guns on the Kitakami are largely ornamental, so definitely she would take torpedo-centric skills, but I'm not sure about other ships, at least in most contexts. All right, next skill is Consumable Specialist. I think this is going to be extremely popular. It's a approximate replacement for Jack of all Trades, which is a level 2 skill today. Consumable Specialist is a level 1 skill. It reduces the reload down of a select number of consumables. So main battery reload booster, torpedo reload booster, spotting, aircraft, fighter, defensive AA fire by 10%. So this is actually better than Jack of all Trades, which reduces the cooldown by 5%. Plus it's now a level 1 skill. So I think this is going to be a very commonly taken skill. The next skill is AA Gunner. This is the same as what we saw with the battleship skills. It increases the number of explosions in these long-range AA salvos by 1. Could be useful in an AA-centric build. I'm not completely sold on how useful that is. The next skill is Pyrotechnist, and this is now a level 2 skill and acts as sort of a poor man's version of Demolition Expert, our Demolition Expert that we have today as a level 3 skill. It increases the chance of fire from main battery and secondary battery shells by 1%. So might be, or it's probably still going to be useful for HE spammers, but I imagine that battleship mains are going to welcome the notion that the chance of fire is being reduced for those ships that do take it. Next skill is another torpedo specialist skill, so torpedo armament specialist. This will increase torpedo speed by 5%, but unlike torpedo acceleration, which is the current level 2 skill, this new skill would not reduce the range on the torpedoes. Next skill, Consumables Expert. Again, another new skill. Again, I think this is going to be incredibly useful and popular on cruiser builds. It increases the action time of hydro, radar, smoke, and I think probably the deployment, meaning how long of a line of smoke you can lay down, not how long the smoke remains active. And then also engine boost, and it increases the action time by 10%. So again, I think that this is going to be very popular on the majority of cruisers. Next skill, Spotting Aircraft Expert. This is new. It does something I think is very useful to the spotting aircraft consumable. So one of the things that I don't like about the spotting aircraft implementation that we have today is that the cooldown time is stupidly long. It's 4 minutes, right? So what this skill would do is it would cut the reload time in half. It would add 2 charges to the spotting aircraft consumable, but then the spotting aircraft action time would be cut in half. So you could put up the planes more frequently. They wouldn't stay up as long, but you would get more charges out of it. And that feels like that would be quite useful. Without actually using it, it's hard to tell. But my read on this is that for ships that use the spotting aircraft with regularity, especially the long-range artillery cruisers, this would be a very useful skill. Next skill is AA Gunner's Training Expert. Again, new. It increases the reinforcement of the priority sector. And one thing that Wargaming made clear in their notes is that the 20% addition is not a multiplicative, it's additive. So today, a priority sector reinforcement of 135% would go to 155%. As an example. So again, for AA-centric builds, this is would be a very useful skill. Next skill is Demo Man. This one is kind of interesting. So it increases HE and SAP shell damage by 10%, but there's a significant trade-off. It will increase your ship detectability by 15%. Now, we saw a similar skill for the battleships that would increase AP shell damage by 5%, but it increased flooding and fire duration by 40%. This has a similar sort of like potential trade-off. I don't know if it's as steep as we see with the battleship skill, but I'm kind of a mixed opinion about how useful this would be. I think we'd actually have to trial it out to see, depending upon your play style, you may be willing to give up the detection and have increased detection to get the increased alpha on the shells. I don't know. We'll see. Last torpedo-centric skill, and again, this is new. Torpedo Man Demolition Expert increases torpedo damage by 15%. So same argument as with the other torpedo-centric skills, clearly useful for the Kitakami, arguably useful for other long-range torpedo cruisers under certain situations. Next skill to me is going to be almost a must-have for any heavy cruiser. So AP Demolition Expert, it will increase AP shell damage by 7%, and it only applies to shell sizes of greater than 190 millimeters. So it doesn't apply to things like the Dmitry Donskoy, the Tallinn, the Molotov that have like the 180 millimeter guns. It doesn't apply to any of the other light cruisers. So this is clearly aimed at heavy cruisers. And yeah, if you're a US Navy heavy cruiser, or you're a German heavy cruiser, or basically any heavy cruiser that fires AP, maybe other than the Italians, this feels like, yes, I want, to increase my AP shell damage. So I think this is going to be a very attractive skill for a lot of players. All right, the next skill, which is a level 4 skill that's new, is Straight A Artillerist, and this has a very similar function, or nearly identical to the to a skill of the same name for battleships. So when when an enemy ship is detected within your secondary battery range, if you have this skill trained, the reload time on your secondary armament will be reduced by 10%, and the reload time of your main battery will be reduced by 8%. Now, on battleships, this skill reduces the main battery reload time by 10%, so it's slightly better. This, to me, is less compelling for cruisers. It might be good. It might be useful for brawling cruisers in certain game modes, like clan brawls or the ranked sprint season that we just came out of, where engagements were very close. So I can see that it might be useful there, but it feels too specialized for cruisers and general gameplay. That's just kind of my initial read on it. All right, next skill, Brawler. I think this one is going to be incredibly popular with cruisers. This is new. What it will do is that if there are more enemy ships within your main battery range than there are allied ships. So let's say that your main battery range is 18 kilometers. And whether you fired your guns, if there are more detected opponents within your firing range than allies, then this skill kicks in. What it does is it increases your ship speed by 8%, and it decreases dispersion of your shells by 10%. And so this would be a very valuable skill for those long-range artillery cruisers that are maybe kiting against a strong flank that's pushing in against them. Again, it's quite potentially quite temperamental, because it depends on being able to detect more opponents that are within your main battery range than allies. And so while you technically might be on a weak flank, if that condition isn't met, because you're always obviously aware of the location of your allies and which ones are within your main battery range, but you're not always aware of all of your opponents that are theoretically within your main battery range. This could be like sort of flipping on and off depending upon how ships are getting detected at the time. So, but I could see that this could be very useful. All right, last skill, which is, changed for lack of a better term. So what Expert AA Gunner does is it combines the damage elements of BFT and AFT for AA. So today BFT increases continuous AA damage by 10%, and AFT increases the shell damage from the long range flak burst by 15%. This skill combines those effects, but amplifies, excuse me, the continuous AA damage to 28% instead of 10. So this would clearly be a very useful skill for AA builds. All right, doing a time check. I'm way over 12 minutes. All right. So, but it is definitely going faster than the last video. Okay, last item dropped because there are some important ones here. So, preventative maintenance is gone, and I think that's going to be a big deal for a lot of players because I know that a lot of my cruisers I take preventative maintenance. Ialert is gone. There's no equivalent to reducing the cooldown charges on your damage control. Jack of all trades for damage control, repair party, hydro, and radar don't exist anymore. So while there is the consumables specialist, where is it here? Yeah, consumables specialist, which reduces the cooldown on some consumables, it doesn't do it for others. And so the effect of Jack of all trades is, at least the full effect is no longer available. Smokescreen expert is gone. And I know that this is going to be a big deal for a lot of cruiser players that like to play smoke cruisers. Now, one other thing I want to stress here, and I have talked about it in the other videos, all of these changes are subject to change. So all the analysis I'm covering here could end up being modified. I suspect that the majority will hold, but there could be things in here that people are going to have strong objection to, and Wargaming will make adjustments. So we'll see. Last stand for cruisers is gone. There is an approximate last stand replacement for destroyers, which I'll get to when I cover destroyers in a later video. Basics of survivability, which reduces the duration of floods and fires, is gone, as is fire prevention. So I'm jumping around here a little bit. So the combination of some of these survivability endurance skills, the fact that they're getting dropped for cruisers, I think is a big issue potentially for the super cruisers, which have 60-second duration fires and basically need to build mostly into tank survivability, tank concealment builds, and losing these, sort of these endurance skills, I think could be a big deal for like Alaska players or Kronstadt or Eger, Siegfried, Yoshino, etc., Stalingrad, etc. So all of the super heavy cruisers, those could be big issues. Torpedo armament expert, which reduces the reload on torpedoes, is gone. This is probably less controversial for cruiser players. This, again, would have been very useful on a Kitakami, but is, like I said, to me is not quite so critical for cruisers. The manual fire control for secondary armament skill, otherwise known as manual secondaries, does not exist for cruisers now. That was really interesting for like meme builds, but it wasn't the norm. So I don't see this as a big deal. And then lastly, the massive AA fire skill is being completely removed from the game under the current proposal. And I don't think anybody has any misgivings about that at all. So, all right, so that's the structure, or that's changing. Now, let me get to a little bit to the cruiser build. So the core skills that I see here, and not all of these are going to be required and not all of them apply to every ship, but the core skills I see are gunner, which is expert marksman, loader, which is expert loader. Expert marksman's not, or gunner is not really required on all cruisers. Expert loader capabilities are not really required on all cruisers, especially like the Royal Navy light cruisers. Consumable specialist, I think, will be very popular because this is the jack of all trades for a lot of consumables. Incoming fire alert or alarming and Argus-eyed, which are the equivalent of incoming fire alert and priority target, will also be very popular. I think these are probably going to be redundant, so you either take one or the other, and not both. That would be my expectation. Consumables expert, which increases the action time of hydro and radar and spotting aircraft, fighter, etc. This to me would likely be very useful. Adrenaline rush is, again, I think should be present on all surface combat ship builds, period. Now, when you take it depends upon how many skill points you have and what else you need in your build, but it eventually should be part of every commander build for all surface combat ships. AP Demolition Expert, I mentioned this already. I think this is going to be a borderline must-have for heavy cruisers. The Italian cruisers might not be so compelled to take this because their SAP shells are so good that they don't use AP as frequently. but definitely cruisers, heavy cruisers that like have very strong AP. You know, again, Soviet heavy cruisers, U.S. Navy, German. This to me would be like, you know, almost a must-have. Brawler, which is the skill that increases your speed and improves your shell dispersion when there are more opponents detected within your main battery range than allies, to me would probably be very useful. But it's probably a late skill acquisition because it feels somewhat specialized. And maybe it's not. Maybe I shouldn't classify it as a core skill. Maybe that's a misplacement. And then lastly, concealment expert is again very common for the vast majority of cruisers. A few other skills to consider: long range artillery cruisers, spotting aircraft expert for those that carry the spotting aircraft. Clearly, to me, that strikes me as very useful. Close support cruisers like the Royal Navy light cruisers, the U.S. Navy cruisers with radar like I said the Minotaur, the Worcester, etc. This would again be very useful. And then for AA-centric builds, you've got a few as well. So not all of these could be taken at once, obviously, but it gives you a sense of what the structures, how the new structure could play out. But again, all of this is subject to change, and certainly will undergo some changes. So I think that's going to wrap it up. This has gone half the time of the previous video. It's still a little longer than I wanted, but hopefully this is a little more consumable than the previous video. I hope you found the information here useful and interesting. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, we hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.